Recently, Guitar Player magazine, the Bible for fretted instrument fanatics of all persuasions, devoted an entire issue to the life and work of Jimi Hendrix. That in itself is a rather rare and singular honor for a contemporary instrumentalist, especially for one who is so totally committed to the massive electronic style. After all, pioneers like Django Reinhardt, Charlie Christian, and Wes Montgomery have yet to be accorded a similar tribute. What was even more remarkable about that issue, an obsessively detailed reevaluation of Jimi's career that extended to heated debates about what kind of strings and amp and guitar settings he really used. It was the total agreement from all of his peer musicians on the fact that he was the man, the one who took it the furthest, plumbing the limitless sound potential of the electric guitar with his truly inimitable Fender Stratocaster style. Usually you'd have a hard time getting a room full of lead guitarists to agree on anything, much less talk to each other. Generally, they tend to be fairly neurotic, suspicious, and occasionally hostile breed, perhaps due to the shrieking frenzy implicit in the sound of their instrument. Or maybe it's because they've been basking in the spotlight a little too long. In any case, an impressive roster of modern guitarists, including Larry Coryell, Mahavishnu John McLaughlin, Johnny Winter, Mike Bloomfield, Robin Ford, Toy Caldwell, Luther Allison, Phil Upchurch, and so many others, even the hard-to-please Robert Fripp, universally held Jimi in very high esteem. A modern miracle for these fragmented times. Even Les Paul, the man who created the other guitar of the same name that Jimi rarely ever used, had a lot of nice things to say. Basically, most anyone who plays the guitar these days has fallen under the shadow of his powerful, ongoing presence at one time or another. The gamut runs from copycat idolatry to, at the very least, grudging admiration. Beyond guitar players, however, there's a curious ambivalence that lingers around the contours of the Hendrix myth. Some listeners, more specifically a famous pioneer rock critic who is now largely forgotten, were initially repelled by the all-encompassing power of his hipness. Bypassing the new universe of electronic sound montages that blasted out of his stacked Marshall amplifiers, they focused in on his stance, the blatant sexual rapport with his instrument, the clothes, and the overall studied casualness which pervaded Jimi's every move. In essence, Jimi was just putting himself over, with all the know-how acquired during more than a decade's worth of work as a backup man for people like Little Richard, Curtis Knight, and the Isleys. The problem was that Jimi was so good, so strong. People who should have known better couldn't bring themselves to confront the sheer intensity of his presence. They blanked out on him, labeling him as a jive artist who played solos with his mouth and humped his guitar, finally tucking him away in safe little category to keep him off their minds. In the meantime, Jimi clung persistently to the visions and sound constructs colliding around in his brain. Even with the rather large amount of excellent recordings that he left behind, one still has the deep-down feeling that he was never completely happy about his studio work. A recurrent theme in interviews with Hendrix is his perpetual frustration at the gap between what he heard and what got put down on vinyl. Not too many people realized that his music was essentially supercharged R&B with a soulful blues feeling. They got hung up with the top. All those brilliantly overlapping spacey voice and guitar overdubs that admittedly exerted such a pervasive, if largely unrecognized influence on the contemporary black and white music that was to follow him. At the time, however, many black thought Jimi was just a wee bit too psychedelic for their tastes. His music virtually never graced the playlists of black radio stations. At this point, that dual-edged black-white rejection syndrome that plagued Hendrix through his entire career holds a special irony. First because there is a whole school of young Hendrix apostles running the gamut from Robin Trower, whose well-schooled taste and sensitive touch make him a legit contender, to Frank Marino, whose pallid instant replay Hendrix moves are as pathetic as only a Canadian acid casualty burnout case could be, busily playing their trade on the concert circuit. It is now abundantly clear that Hendrix is the creator of a whole new discipline on the electric guitar, and although he'll probably never be put in a league with other innovators like Armstrong, Ellington, Parker, Gillespie, and Miles Davis, anybody who's bent the guitar string knows that he deserves the same kind of credit. On the R&B front, perhaps the keenest irony comes from the fact that Hendrix's most recent recordings, Crash Landing and the about-to-be-released Midnight Lightning, amply demonstrate the sizzling blues and R&B core was the essence of Jimi's music. Alan Douglas, the perceptive and ultra-hip producer and multimedia innovator, has had access to the special stash of Hendrix tapes left behind in a New Jersey warehouse. He got to know Hendrix real well during the period that Jimi was seeking musical solace from the experience hype in a variety of New York recording studios like the Record Plant and Electric Lady. As usual, Jimi was desperately trying to push his music way beyond the limits imposed by overzealous fans and friends. Douglas, who had an extensive background producing jazz artists, was there to help encourage Jimi's progressive tendencies. In fact, Hendrix was getting so far out on the borderline in terms of melodic concepts, radically shifting time signatures, and unexpected key changes. Most of the musicians he was playing with, a little bit of Noel Redding, Mitch Mitchell, but mostly Billy Cox and Buddy Miles, found it literally impossible to keep up with him through his extended sorties. The only one operating on the same free level was Larry Young, the gifted jazz keyboard player. Their already legendary extended jam is still due to be released. Of course, John McLaughlin played with Jimi also, although he claims that he isn't on any of the recently unearthed tapes. Seems upon hearing what everyone assumed was their taped collaboration, McLaughlin said something to the effect of, "Well, that's great, but it's not me playing. It's probably Jim McCarty, Detroit Wheels and Cactus." Jim McCarty? So what Douglas has been doing is taking the original Hendrix lead and multiple rhythm guitar tracks and adding on a sympathetic rhythm section and occasional backing vocals. Although he is obsessively dedicated to Hendrix's music and has spent thousands of hours in the studio, meticulously refining each track, guided by a spiritual atonement to Hendrix's musical consciousness, I am not completely convinced that this latest in the line of legit attempts to do Jimi justice is entirely valid. Crash Landing definitely had its moments and a contemporary R&B feeling to the overall production, but some of the grafted on music tended to take something away from the shattering brilliance of Jimi's playing. Maybe it was too competent, too muted. Judging from the rough mixes on the upcoming Midnight Lightning LP, a showcase for Jimi's fluid and daringly inventive blues style, there is a lot of potentially explosive Hendrix material headed our way. His playing is centered, but also fearless in its experimental tendencies. The range of sounds and textures, the energy level, is absolutely awe-inspiring. Of course, I will reserve judgment on the finished product because Alan Douglas still has a heavy responsibility to fulfill as posthumous final arbitrator and architect of the Hendrix sound. As far as Jimi's guitar is concerned, however, as always, it's right there in the grooves. Thanks for watching Rock Buzz. Be sure to subscribe.